today we have a very short show. Just wanted to do a few things. One was that a couple days ago, um, we didn't really talk that much about Yemen yesterday or the day before. Well, maybe the day before. I've been working so much it all runs together. But I found a really interesting, like 30-ish minute interview that the New York Times did between basically like a podcaster and one of their bureau chiefs, specifically the bureau chief for the Gulf region, right? So this is somebody who's been covering Yemen for like 20 years, like a very prolonged period of time. And I found it to be a fascinating interview, and I wanted to go over it because it's one of really the only places that I haven't seen just automatically regurgitate the Houthi propaganda line, right? Like a lot of mainstream news outlets, I know that we decry mainstream news all the time, but mainstream news just keeps saying, "Oh, they're doing this for Palestinians. They're doing this for the Palestinians." But like that's their stated reason, right? Nations have multiple reasons usually for doing certain things. And if you believe the altruistic line, that's generally because you're falling for their propaganda. The same way the United States does like aid to foreign countries, right? We do aid, and oftentimes it's said to be like, oh, well, we're doing it to help the war-stricken population of X country, or help rebuild after the destruction of X country in a natural disaster, right? But there are ulterior motives. There are other reasons that the United States does that. It's not just because they're run by bleeding heart liberals. They're done for the furtherance of the US's empire, right? This is often what is called neo-colonialism in a lot of senses. It is the use of economics to further colonial goals. Because often, like when US dollars flow into another country to help them rebuild, well, often American companies get contracts, right? With the rebuilding efforts, or with the companies the country that is being targeted after they're rebuilt, right? There are a number of knock-on effects that are recognized as beneficial, right? It's not an altruistic act by the United States, and if you believe that it is, you are falling for US propaganda. All I'm asking is for people to have the same amount of skepticism that you have for like the United States for the Houthis, a movement that controls a sizable majority of Yemen, and the Yemeni population has has a military hundreds of thousands of troops strong, has sophisticated propaganda and PR tools at their disposal, and like, if anything else, even if you disagree with me that the Houthis aren't like an evil regime, like, you have to understand and respect the fact that they do indeed have the capabilities to lie about their stated reasons for doing something, right? So, with all of that being said, we're going to dive into this New York Times podcast called What the Houthis Really Want, which I found, again, fascinating. There's no video element to it, so we're just going to play the audio, and I'm going to be periodically pausing to interject my commentary, because
yeah, they're killing thousands
I
of
have a lot of
Palestinian
thoughts.
children for the good of them, like when God commanded the genocide of the Canaanites for the good of the Canaanites.
What? Thank you for the $5 dono. Don't know what that had to do with anything that I said, but thank you. All right, we are going to dive into this. And it's the daily New York Times podcasts. So I'm not a big listener to New York Times podcasts, but I saw this while doing research on like what the Houthis actually want. Because my initial assumption was that they wanted Iran to come into the Yemeni conflict on their side. However, while that seems to be one possible motivation, there are several others that I had not considered that are brought up in this that I think are really interesting and worth thinking about.
From New York Times, I'm Michael Barbaro. This is The Daily. Over the past few months, attacks by Houthi militants on global trade and the Western military, which once seemed like a dangerous sideshow to the war in Gaza, have become a full-blown crisis. Today, my colleague, Gulf Bureau Chief Vivian Niran, on what the Houthis
I also might speed this up, because we have, again, limited time.
really want.
Also, pro tip, speeding up any podcast instantly turns like their intro music into a bop, if it isn't already.
It's Thursday, January 18th.
There's a marked escalation of tensions along one of the world's busiest shipping routes.
Houthi militants claimed responsibility for yet another attack on a container ship.
The latest target of Yemen's Houthis, Norwegian tanker Strinda, struck by a missile.
A U.S. warship shot down 14 drones fired by suspected Houthi rebels in Yemen.
The escalation of attacks have encouraged a series of shipping companies to announce they would suspend their movements through the Red Sea.
A United States official tells CNN the U.S. military has carried out strikes on multiple Houthi targets in Yemen. This war could be escalating big time.
The Pentagon confirms it has carried out more strikes against the Yemen-based Houthi rebels, the third assault on the group in recent days.
Houthi leaders said this aggression will not go unanswered, threatening to keep on attacking those ships that are passing through the Red Sea. President Biden saying he will not.
Okay, we can skip this. You've heard all of the headlines.
From New York Times, I'm Michael Barbaro.
God damn it.
This is
They're not. No, Israel.
and I think all of us, and triggered a very significant military response from the U.S. and its allies. The question I think all of us have had with increasing urgency is, what exactly has motivated these militants, the Houthis, to do this? What do they want? And how do these attacks in the Red Sea serve that cause?
Well, the Houthis' stated motivation has, from the start, been all about, the Palestinians and Gaza and sort of forcing Israel to end its siege on Gaza. They have, for a very long time, kind of centered opposition to Israel and hostility towards the United States and the Palestinian cause in their narrative and in their ideology.
Mm-hmm.
And they've really been kind of bringing that up. They've essentially been saying, look at what Israel is doing to the Palestinians. No one is standing up for them. None of the other Arab governments have really done anything. They're not doing an oil embargo. They're not going to war. And that we essentially, and they represent themselves as, the Yemeni government, we are the only state in the region that is doing anything about this, that is taking on Israel and the United States.
So kind of the question, I think, is, should you believe them? I think that my answer is very easily no. But for a lot of people who might be new to this conflict, at first blush, it sounds like they're telling the truth. Maybe, possibly.
So the way that they're pushing all of this messaging out to the world is through their incredibly robust wartime propaganda. They produce these music videos and songs and poems. They're very active on social media, especially on X and TikTok.
You mean they aren't just primitive people who live in huts? They have access to social media and are able to create complex and nuanced pieces of art and media that further their own nationalistic cause? That's crazy. That's wow. You mean they have electricity? Like, honest to God, a lot of people who support the Houthis seem to think of them as just like poor whittle beans who live in huts and are like the underdogs in the Yemeni conflict. They won. They effectively have won that conflict. The fact that Saudi Arabia negotiated a truce and ceasefire like a year and a half ago kind of indicates that. right? But I digress.
What exactly do these social media messages that they're putting out say?
They've released really catchy songs in Arabic that kind of say things like, oh, you know, we're Yemeni, but our blood is Palestinian.
You mean they might be producing songs in a media industry that has been completely dominated for their religious zealotry and the nationalistic goals? Curious.
They have done things like put up, you know, Twitter polls essentially saying, you know, who are you on the side of? Are you on the side of genocide in America, or are you on the side of, you know, the brave Yemenis fighting genocide and standing up for justice, essentially? And that's a Twitter poll that they put out in English.
Wow.
Kind of just
I'll give the Houthis that. They are certainly brave. I just think that their political cause is hopelessly evil. Overall. Again, I support the end of the genocide in the Gaza Strip, but the Houthis are evil.
trying to sort of speak to a different audience. So
their
that's
political
a very
ideology
tool for them.
So what the Houthis say they want, and what's captured in these propaganda videos that you just described, is to use these attacks to pressure Israel and Israel's allies, primarily the U.S., into ending Israel's military operation in Gaza. That's what they claim this is all about.
Yes, that's exactly what they say.
Okay, so that's what the Houthis want everyone to see as their animating cause. Is that, based on your reporting, based on your long-term understanding of the Houthis, is it...
Again, the person who's being interviewed here is the longtime bureau chief of the New York Times, meaning that, like, her entire job is keeping an eye and reporting on the news that happens in the region of the world that includes Yemen.
That straightforward.
What are the Houthis wrong about? Well, they created a secret police within their school system that reports on whether students are supportive of the regime or not, and any students who are, you know, critical of either the Houthis or Iran are arrested and tortured, and sometimes disappeared. They perform summary executions against queer people in their occupied territory. And they forcibly conscript child soldiers as young as 10, and at the last counting, which was in 2018, there were around 20,000 child soldiers, making up about 10% of their military. And it has been 5 years since then, or I guess almost 6 years since that last, census or reporting on the size of their child soldier army. And despite them signing a pact with the UN to not engage in conscripting child soldiers, i.e. turning child slaves into soldiers, they have continued the practice, and there are doubtlessly far more child soldiers currently within Houthi-controlled armed forces. So yeah, I think that the child enslaving religious far-right movement that seeks to establish a monarchy ruled by a theocracy, like a theocratic monarchy, I think that they're bad. I think that all of that is bad. I think the fact that they need to build dividers in classrooms to separate male students from female students, I think that's bad. Yeah. I think a lot of it is bad. Child slavery, chief among them. You know, that's not even mentioning, like, most of the things that I think are awful about their political ideology. But moving on.
Forward, is that the reality of what is really motivating them?
Hey,
No, I think their behavior and their motivations are much more complicated than that. I mean, the Houthis ultimately want relevance, they want power.
Whoa, you mean they might have more complicated motives and motivations than the stated one that they know gives them incredibly positive PR in the region and domestically? That's crazy, dog. You mean their propaganda might not be 100% honest? That's crazy.
They have a lot of domestic aims, and in so many ways, the war in Gaza has really been just this huge gift from the sky for them. It enables them to achieve so many of their own aims. I mean, I can't even describe to you how strange it is as somebody who's covered the Houthis for many years, and they were this really just little-known group, to see how prominent they are and how much people who really know almost nothing about Yemen now talk about them and know who they are all over the world.
Well, tell us that story of who the Houthis are, where they come from, and how the operation that they are now conducting that has really kind of menaced the Red Sea and much of the West and its economy, how it achieves its real goals.
It's funny. I went back into times past to see like if we'd written about the early history of the Houthis, and we had almost nothing about them before even the mid 2000s, which was interesting to me. So essentially, the Houthis' history as a movement dates back to the 1990s. They take their name from their tribe, which is this extended clan whose home territory is in the mountains of northern Yemen, near the border with Saudi Arabia. And they follow this subset of Shia Islam and say that they're the descendants of the Prophet Muhammad. So when they began their movement, they were really sort of a cultural and religious revivalist group that later became quite political.
Hey, Hypno
And they
Amber.
gained prominence essentially as this tribally based resistance movement to the Yemeni government at the time. And they very much portrayed themselves as fighting against corruption, fighting against foreign influence. And their rise to prominence really coincided with the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. And they really absorbed that invasion, which was...
I do have to say, this podcaster doing the interview has the most podcaster noise I've ever heard in my life. Like, the most, like, liberal-leaning podcaster voice. Like a Minecraft villager. I find it both endearing and very irritating at the same time. It's hard to really encapsulate my feelings about it.
Incredibly unpopular, throughout
Hey,
the Middle
Spitfire.
East and among Arab countries. They sort of saw this as an incredibly destabilizing military incursion into their region that they did not support.
Right.
And the Houthis really seized on that and on sort of general rising anti-Americanism and incorporated that battling foreign influence really deep into their ideology.
Right, and of course the war in Iraq was about as clear a case of a foreign power stepping into their neighborhood as you could possibly imagine.
Right,
Yeah, it's hardly surprising that the U.S., like, basically unpromptedly invading Iraq would be a radicalizing event for a lot of people in the region. That's not... I'm not surprised to learn that that people responded to that throughout the entire Middle East. Yeah.
And for them, they really saw U.S. influence in their own country as well, because the longtime Yemeni ruler who they were fighting against was this U.S. allied autocrat. And he had been in power for more than 30 years, very repressive, very corrupt government, and very unpopular. And they were, for a long time, fighting against him. So Yemen is already in this really kind of destabilized moment around 2010.
Yeah, but by the way, when they're talking about, like, the former ruler of Yemen being corrupt... he was viewed as so corrupt that was kind of the initial split between the official Yemeni government and the STC militia movement that only recently got resolved in Yemen. The STCs being kind of a UAE-backed faction, and that all kind of happened after the president of Yemen tried to, like, remove the governor of one of its primary cities in southern Yemen. Or remove the mayor of one of its primary cities. And people basically just rejected that, and kind of a breakaway separatist faction formed under the STC militias. But that has since been resolved. But the fact that the old Yemeni government was corrupt is certainly, like, well documented.
In 2011, when the Arab Spring arrives all over the region, there are these sort of revolutions toppling strongmen.
Right.
And one of the strongmen who gets toppled is Ali Abdullah Saleh, the Yemeni leader, in this sort of like fit of popular anger. Now, what happened over the next couple of years was really chaotic.
I disagree with the I disagree with the contention that the Houthis are actively doing anything to stop the genocide in Gaza. I don't think firing rockets at civilian ships constitutes stopping a genocide in a country thousands of miles away. Like that doesn't do anything. Making the coffee 10 cents more expensive in Israel is not stopping the genocide. If they were doing something more directly to actually stop the genocide, I might be in support of it, but this is not that. Especially considering, as I brought up before, the disruption in the Red Sea prevents vital shipping lanes from reaching Sudan, which currently has 23 million people relying on foreign aid just for subsistence living, and disrupting the delivery of, like, food and medical supplies from the international community to Sudan literally puts millions of people's lives in danger from that alone, given the drought and famine in Sudan. So I think that there's a lot of knock-on effects that people just don't seem to give a shit about. Maybe because it's in Sudan. I don't know. I don't know why people don't seem to give a shit about that, but they don't.
And eventually, the Houthis saw an opportunity and...
Islam is inherently political. All religion is inherently political and requires jihad, holy war. I don't think Islam requires jihad. I know plenty of Muslims in my day-to-day life. They are not trying to wage a jihad against me just because I am of a different religious background than them. That's ridiculous.
2014, they seized control.
I'm a socialist, bud. Like, I don't know how to tell you that I'm not a liberal, but sure. You continue thinking that attacking civilian ships with rockets is going to somehow stop a genocide from a country that has its main ports off of the Red Sea and in the Mediterranean. Okay.
Of the Yemeni capital of Sana'a. And they sort of installed themselves as the alternative.
So now that this clan from the northern mountains of Yemen has taken over the capital and the institutions, I would imagine, of Yemen's government, what does the world make of that?
Well, it's something that pretty immediately made Saudi Arabia, Yemen's much larger neighbor to the north, very nervous and concerned.
Why?
The Houthis are essentially a militia, right? They're this kind of religiously inspired militia, and that alone was enough to make Saudi Arabia...
Yeah, kind of what I think a lot of people don't fully understand about the Houthis is, like, it would be like if you got the big tent evangelical revivalist movement that swept the United States in the 1960s, 50s and 60s. It's like if you took those people, told them that they needed to kill the government, and gave them a ton of guns, and then they went and did that. Like, that's kind of the equivalent. Like, what do you think that U.S. evangelicals would establish, like, a super great government? No, they wouldn't. It would be terrible. It would be a terrible dystopian fascist empire.
Arabian nervous. They have this very long border with Yemen. They did not want a militia on the other side of the border. But perhaps equally as important to that is the fact that the Houthis had become aligned with Iran, which is Saudi Arabia's...
like, even more extreme than MAGA, Robert Adsat. Like, again, it would have to be, like, hundreds of thousands of them armed with guns marching on the capital. That would be the equivalent.
Regional rival. And Saudi Arabia was very worried about the idea of this Iran-influenced militia, potentially Iran-supported militia, taking over this large chunk of its southern border and what that would mean.
Again, it's incredible how when you recontextualize their movement, like if it occurred in America, people in America seem to be able to be like, oh yeah, that would be kind of bad, wouldn't it? But again, because they view it as like, they view the Houthis as like primitive people, they just do not expect sophistication from them. They do not expect, like, the same moral weight from them as they do from, like, a violent fundamentalist religious movement in the United States, which is ridiculous. That is a standard born out of racism, my friends.
And the sense of being sort of crunched in by Iran-influenced proxies from different sides. So basically, in early 2015, Saudi Arabia gets together a coalition of Arab governments, and this Saudi-led coalition starts a bombing campaign in Yemen.
A direct strike in broad day.
Also, I need to clarify, literally, there are, in this conflict, there are no good sides. Every side...
I keep forgetting to auto-renew.
Oh, Stoudman, thank you for getting a sub. I appreciate that. There are no good actors. In the Yemeni war, there are no good actors. The Saudi Arabian-backed Yemeni government, extraordinarily bad. The United States, which backed the Saudi Arabian intervention in Yemen, bad. The Houthi movement, bad. Like, all of them are horrible actors when it comes to this. So, like, in order to understand this conflict, you kind of need to throw out the idea that anyone is the good guy. And I think that that's something that a lot of people in America really struggle with.
It's too graphic to show in full, but the bodies being pulled out belong to 3-month-old Samud and her 3-year-old brother, Nabil.
A bombing campaign that much of the world eventually comes to see as really intensive, gruesome, and lethal.
Right.
Residents say Saudi warplanes have dropped more than 100 bombs in civilian neighborhoods over the past few days.
Yeah, I don't know. I think bombing and enslaving children on both sides of the conflict is pretty monstrous. Like, objectively monstrous.
Yemen was already one of the Arab world's poorest countries, and this war essentially pitched it into one of the world's worst humanitarian crises.
United Nations officials are warning that Yemen faces famine.
Like, I don't know. I think it's pretty monstrous to be like, well, you know, it's only horrific war crimes from a certain point of view. Like, okay, then from a certain point of view, there's not a genocide in Gaza, right? I don't subscribe to that view. That's your view, I guess. Or from, like, you know, it's subjective whether or not 7 million people in Sudan dying of deprivation as a result of, like, the pirate attacks in the Red Sea. You know, that's subjective whether or not that's bad. No, I think that's bad. You know, I'm gonna plant my flag in the sand and be like, nah, I think that's maybe, you know, among the most awful things that humans can do to each other.
Scale the world has not seen in decades. They are talking of millions of victims.
There's been a tremendous loss of life. There have been cholera outbreaks. It's a great humanitarian crisis.
Many, many people are dying. It's this incredibly brutal war.
The UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has appealed for urgent action to stop Yemen from descending into anarchy.
Yemen is collapsing before our eyes. We cannot stand by and watch.
And the U.S. was actually quite important to that war in the beginning. The Obama administration...
Well, like, from the Saudi point of view, KBS, like, yes, they are monsters. But it's not just an excuse for the princes to bomb civilians. From the Saudi point of view, like, this is a fundamentalist religious movement that exists in direct opposition of their fundamentalist religious movement. And it's right on their border, and they've successfully toppled the Yemeni government that they backed. Like, that's gonna put them on edge as kind of the figurehead of the Sunni Muslim movement in the region. You know, they're considered like a regional leader, like both politically and religiously, and like, this is a threat right on their doorstep that they seem unable to handle, and that is bad PR for them, and like, it's going to have an effect for sure. So they had definite, like, geopolitical reasons for doing this too, but like, yeah, Saudi Arabia is full of like horrific shit. Like, they chop up journalists who are inconvenient to the regime. Like, they're like objectively evil.
Provided military support and intelligence to the Saudi-led coalition, refueling planes. Of course, many of the weapons that they were dropping were American weapons. So again, this kind of starts to fuel that sense from the Houthis and from many Yemenis that they are, you know, being conspired against by foreign powers.
And
exactly,
why,
KBS.
Vivian, does the United States?
Exactly, KBS. But also, this is a threat to their religious beliefs, right on their doorstep, and that has an army of 200,000 people.
Get involved in this battle.
Much of it seems to be because Saudi Arabia was such an important and is such an important U.S. ally. And the Yemeni government at the time, of course, was also U.S.-backed. So initially, the U.S. was supportive of this goal of restoring the legitimate Yemeni government. Over time, the U.S. support for the war really began to fray and become quite controversial. And you started to see a lot of political pressure in Washington for the U.S. to pull back its support, and sort of fears that the U.S. was implicated in that destruction. And so basically from around 2018 and 2019 onwards, the war loses its international support. And, you know, Saudi Arabia and the coalition members find themselves sort of on the back foot, and they gradually start to sort of pull back their involvement in the war.
Got it. And where does this leave the Houthis?
This essentially leaves the Houthis in power. It's really kind of incredible that they started as this underdog force, this ragtag militia fighting in flip-flops. And, you know, by 2021, 2022, they are essentially the dominant power in Yemen. And they're feeling quite confident. They're essentially feeling like they won the war.
So how do we get from this unlikely victory that the Houthis have over major powers, Saudi Arabia, the United States, to a campaign of bombing and attacks in the Red Sea that would seem to endanger all that the Houthis gained in that prolonged war.
Exactly, right? That's the question. This is the question I've been wondering the entire time. Because it seems to me like you just effectively won, like, control over, the most populated regions of Yemen. You don't have international recognition yet, but you've been taken off of, like, the terrorist watch list. You are becoming a normalized power in the region. Why do the thing that you know is going to send the entire world's military to your doorstep? Right? That's a really good question, because I do not believe, point blank, that a nation state does something like this that has such a little effect on what their stated goal is for purely altruistic reasons. Like, if they announced that they were going to invade Israel somehow, like, that would have a direct impact on, like, Israel's ability to prosecute, like, the genocide in Gaza. But attacking random container ships doesn't do that. It doesn't prevent the genocide. It doesn't, like, actually do much at all to further their stated goal. So what is their actual goal? That's been my question. I assumed it was getting Iranian intervention for them to basically solidify their control over Greater Yemen and kick out the Al-Qaeda factions that have sway over certain parts of the country. I assumed that's what they wanted. But I think that there's more to it than that.
So you have to really remember that since they were founded, the Houthis have been a resistance movement. They've been rebels. That's been their entire identity. And so a rebel force doesn't really naturally then lend itself to becoming a government. They are now the powers that be in Yemen. There's nothing left for them to resist. So they're in this very uncomfortable position in a lot of ways as 2023 rolls around, and people are looking at them to provide basic services. They're looking at them to provide electricity and water. They're looking at them to pay salaries for civil servants who in many cases have gone unpaid for years. And that's quite...
And this, and when I heard her say this while I was listening offline, that's when it clicked for me. This is the classic, like, fascist tactic of, dodging accountability for providing basic domestic needs by diverting your population's attention towards an external threat. If they are not terribly interested in actually governing the territory that they have conquered in, like, an equitable and just way, and instead they want to continue on with the national identity they've forged of nonstop warfare, what better way to do that than to bring your enemies directly to your doorstep? What more radicalizing thing could there be than the United States showing up in person to bomb you after they've been backing your enemies for the last, 30 years? This is perfect for them. Like, they get to basically recruit off of this forever. For as long as this coalition is on their doorstep bombing them, they get to like look into this and recruit nonstop. I looked into it, and there are some estimates that they're recruiting, like, anywhere from, like, 5,000 to 7,000 people a month since they started these piracy attacks to their military, to their armed forces. And that might not seem like a ton, but then you have to consider that their armed forces consist of, like, or at least, in the recent past, around 200,000 soldiers. If they're recruiting, like, 5,000 to 7,000 per month, like, suddenly you're looking at like a military that's going to like be ballooning in size far more than you could have anticipated before October 7th. They do not understand that piracy means we get to bomb them out of existence. Yeah, but I don't think that that's going to be the case either. Because again, they've lasted through like the last decade and a half, 15 years. People have been trying to bomb them out of existence, and they've failed spectacularly. We can certainly destroy their infrastructure that like allows them to be quite as effective at attacking civilian shipping, but in the long term, it is not financially feasible for the United States to be using multi-million-dollar equipment for every time we shoot down one of their $10,000 drones. You know? So I think in the long term, this is going to be something that the United States wants to get out of. But until that happens, it is a huge PR win for the Houthis.
Quite a lot of pressure on the Houthis.
And no doubt to rebuild the entire country.
And they also do need to rebuild the entire country, which is really in ruins. And all of that is quite expensive. And it's not really clear how they're going to navigate their way out of that.
Right.
This is sort of the context.
I disagree, KBS. It's the same argument that people used against the Taliban. Oh, the Taliban will cease to exist. And we weren't able to bomb them out of existence with an occupation of like 20 years, you know? I don't see it. I don't see it going exactly that way. I see attempts to cripple their ability to attack shipping being moderately successful in the short term, but I don't think we're going to be bombing the Houthis out of existence. No, I don't think we could, even if that was the goal.
That October 7th rolls around in. The Houthis are in this difficult position. They're facing this kind of prospect of transitioning into a peacetime government, which is going to be very challenging. And in that context, October 7th comes out of nowhere, and suddenly there's potentially an answer to a lot of their problems.
Well, just explain that. How does Hamas attacking Israel, and Israel obviously preparing a ferocious response, how does that potentially solve all of the Houthi problems you just outlined?
Well, it puts the Houthis at the center of this moment in the region where there's just anger all across the Arab world. And the Houthis really insert themselves into that. And they take it up as an opportunity to really live out their narrative, to finally directly enter a war with Israel, which is their declared great enemy.
Right.
So once the Houthis directly enter this conflict, they're shooting missiles at Israel, they're attacking ships in the Red Sea, their popularity at home skyrockets. They find themselves in a situation where they can use this to recruit more fighters.
Hey, young black economist.
There are enormous rallies that they're holding in the streets of Sana'a of people coming out in solidarity with the Palestinians, protesting against the Israeli bombardment of Gaza.
Yeah, I mean, but that's the thing, KBS. I don't see the United States doing something better than what they did in Afghanistan. Let me put it that way.
They're just these huge crowds of people holding up their slogan, holding up images of the Houthi leader, and it's really quite a galvanizing moment for them.
Like the United States didn't even care to get directly engaged in the Yemeni civil war, and we're certainly not going to care enough to like occupy Yemen and rebuild their entirely destroyed civilian infrastructure. Like that's just not going to happen. I don't see that as a realistic possibility.
So ultimately,
I mean, I agree with Militant Pagan on that one. The Houthis right now, especially with the U.S. bombing campaign, are only going to get stronger from this, at least for the foreseeable future.
Is what the Houthis really want. This is that complicated set of motivations behind their
winners,
decision
losers.
to start hurling missiles into the Red Sea. The Houthis may say that what they're doing is just about defending the Palestinians and trying to end Israel's war in Gaza, but it is multi-pronged. And what the Houthis really want is a simpler way to win the hearts and minds of their own people than being the government of Yemen.
Right. I mean, the Houthis have pushed back against that narrative a lot. They're arguing that they're not doing this for popularity, that it's not about domestic reasons, and they say this is a true moral crusade. We're fighting for justice. But the reality is that on the ground...
how often have you heard arguments like this, right? This is the same argument made during like the Crusades. Oh, we're not going there to seize land and territory. We're going there to spread the good word of Jesus Christ to the unbelieving infidel. Like ours is a pure and moral crusade. Like, how often have you heard that as a justification? We all know it's bullshit when it comes to the like actual crusades. All I'm asking is for a similar amount of skepticism towards current day PR.
They have benefited a lot in a lot of different ways. So it almost doesn't matter to what extent they believe the ideology that they're espousing. On the ground, there has been a massive benefit to them.
And all of that means that the Houthis would seem to have virtually no motivation to stop doing what they're doing, battling the West in the Red Sea.
Not at all. There's really no reason for them to pull back, and they're very comfortable fighting, and that's what they're doing right now. As soon as it stops, it essentially leaves the Houthis back in a challenging position where they're going to have to figure out how to govern. They're going to have to...
I mean, basically, since the development of supply chains in every era, both pre and post capitalism, like if you're attacking like trade caravans, you know, in the middle of nowhere, like, yeah, your local lord is also going to assemble a bunch of like mercenaries to go and kill whoever's doing that. Like that's not just like capitalist supply chains, that's all supply chains, like forever.
To figure out how to be in power and not how to be the rebels.
Mm-hmm.
For the Houthis, it is going to be much easier to keep fighting than it would be for them to govern a country that has been destroyed by decades of war.
Like, and again, to clarify, because I feel like I need to every 5 minutes when we're talking about subjects like this, the United States is also bad. But also the United States is not the only country in the region there. There are 20 other countries actively patrolling the Red Sea now and conducting anti-piracy tactics, right? Like, again, this isn't just the United States. This is anti-piracy action condoned by the UN. Like the UN commissioned like a group of military groups to go down there, military forces to go down there to stop piracy. I'm an engineer in the Merchant Marines, so this is making me nervous going out to sea. Fair. Like that, and I guess this is part of my frustration here. Like, I don't know. Like, this is like definitionally like poking a bear in the eye and like seeing what happens. Yeah, Nenya the cat. Unironically, the idea that multiple sides in a conflict might be bad seems to elude a lot of people, and that's very frustrating to me.
We'll be right back.
Wait, Tanky Logic says Houthis are justified in attacking civilian ships heading to Israel, so doesn't that mean NATO's justified in attacking civilian ships heading to Russia? I mean, again, yeah, it's a dangerous line of logic to go down when you start talking about that. You know, typically civilian shipping has been seen as off limits for the same reason that, you know, historically trade caravans, you don't attack unless you're ready for like a bunch of a small army to come after you, you know? America doesn't have to join the war if they don't want to. There's not a war. Like, if you attack international shipping, international like non-isolationist governments are going to join in on anti-piracy action. Well, they don't have to. I mean, like, ideally, the solution here is for the United States to put pressure on Israel and end the genocide. But they're not, like, first of all, the United States isn't going to do that in response to pirate attacks on international shipping. They're just going to send warships to destroy the pirates. Like, obviously. And since that point is so obvious, it then begs the question, why would the Houthis do something that is guaranteed to bring the Americans there and international forces there? And that's because they're doing it for non-altruistic reasons.
Vivian.
Also, let's be clear, the Houthis don't have the ability to discern which ships are headed for Israeli ports or are owned by Israelis. They don't have the ability to discern that. They also don't have the ability to discern whether they're American ships and owned by Americans. And we know that because Iran, their biggest supporter, had to send their own destroyer to personally escort ships through the Red Sea because they know the Houthis can't tell. If the Houthis could tell, Iran wouldn't need to escort their own ships through the Red Sea.
As the Houthis wage these ongoing attacks, it clearly puts the U.S. in a really complicated spot based on everything you just said, because at some point the U.S. has to respond to these attacks on ships, including U.S.-owned ships and U.S. military ships, but the U.S. has to understand that any retaliation risks playing directly into the complicated motivations you just described. So how does the U.S. try to navigate that?
Right. So for the first few weeks of these attacks, the U.S. does really appear to be trying to...
Yes, militant pagan. The United States and Israel are allies. This is true. You've pointed out something that is accurate.
Avoid entering into this conflict.
And yes, you have accurately pointed out that the current U.S. government is indeed complicit with the genocide in Gaza, which is why we need to put pressure domestically on the U.S. government in order to end the genocide in Gaza. That is the most effective way that we can bring about an end to the genocide in Gaza. The thing that doesn't put pressure on the U.S. government to do that, though, is attacking international shipping. That just gives the U.S. government the chance to flex its military might, which is like something the U.S. is incredibly horny to do at the slightest drop of a hat.
Directly, there does seem to be some degree of recognition that there's a real risk of escalation if they get involved, and that the Houthis essentially could be legitimized by, them attacking the Houthis, right? It's finally recognizing the Houthis as worthy of attack. So there's some resistance in the beginning toward that. There does seem to be a consensus at some point within the U.S. establishment that they do need to do something. And they eventually make this sort of statement with the UK and with this coalition, essentially threatening that if the attacks don't stop, they're going to respond. And that statement does seem to sort of lock them into action at that point, because the Houthis have been very clear that they're not going to stop, that they absolutely have no intention of stopping. And in fact, they've declared at this point that they would prefer a direct war with the United States.
So once the U.S. does decide to retaliate, and it does so in a very forceful way, hitting dozens of targets inside Yemen that are controlled by the Houthis, how does the U.S...
Oh, the coalition is now up to 40 different countries. That's crazy.
Frame it.
Well, the U.S. is very careful to try to frame this as having nothing to do with...
Hey, don't be a doomer, militant pagan. If anything, it's a chance for you to flex your militancy if World War III happens.
Israel and the war in Gaza. They're very concerned that essentially the Houthis are going to be able to weaponize this just to sort of deepen their narrative even more. And so they try to sort of frame it as a coalition response to protect economic interests, to protect global shipping, and really try to emphasize the effect that the Houthi attacks have had on shipping and trade, particularly because they're passing through this incredibly important part of the Red Sea that leads to the Suez Canal.
So when the U.S. responds, what President Biden is saying is, I'm not going to give you the propaganda tool of saying that this conflict is about what you, the Houthis, say it's about, which is Israel and Hamas.
Like, I don't know. Imagine doing something that gets 20% of the world's countries so angry at you that they agreed to engage in military action against you. That's crazy.
In Gaza, we are going to kind of strip all of of that language and that symbolism.
Yes, that is what they say. That doesn't go over very well in the region or in Yemen. I mean, we pretty immediately were speaking to...
Oh, okay. So it is 20. Okay. False information. Stand down.
Yemenis who were saying, even in territories that are hostile towards the Houthis, were saying that, it looks like the U.S. just wants to attack them because they're defending Palestinians.
So immediately, that U.S. effort to kind of parse this and frame it is seen as futile throughout Yemen.
Yeah, it definitely falls flat in Yemen and in the broader Middle East. And there is honestly such a high level of anti-Americanism across the region right now that it's very easy for the Houthis to spread this narrative and to gain popularity over it.
Regardless of how these attacks are being discussed or framed, do the U.S. coalition airstrikes work at all? Are they doing what the United States wants them to do, which is to weaken the Houthis' capacity to strike ships in the Red Sea, or in any way deter the Houthis from
Hey,
continuing
Firestar
to wage
Awesome.
these attacks?
How you doing?
They certainly do not deter the Houthis, who pretty immediately have started to stage attacks again and have vowed that they're going to be staging even bigger attacks. And they've said now that they see not only targets tied to Israel as legitimate targets, but any targets tied to American or British interests as legitimate.
And to be clear, they're indiscriminately attacking ships. Like this is why they've been attacking like Norwegian ships. Like they're not just going after American ships or Israeli ships or UK ships. They're going after any ship that they can get their hands on in the Red Sea.
Legitimate targets for them to hit. So essentially they are now widening the war.
Charlie.
They're saying that this is a world war that we are excited to enter into now and we're ready for it.
Excited to enter. That's how they're framing this.
Yeah, they are really, honestly, with pretty open delight. I mean,
again, this is why I make the comparison between the Houthis and like evangelical conservatives who like believe in the rapture, right? Evangelical conservatives in the United States literally believe that by ushering in World War III, they're starting the process of Armageddon, which will begin with like a colossal war between all the nations, and then they will be raptured. They disagree on the exact order of operations, so you can find people who are like, oh, we'll be raptured before World War III or after. But the point being, like, they're directly comparable to fundamentalist religious zealots in, like, literally any country. And, like, they're literally ready to die for this. They're like you know, evangelicals who are like, you know, I think it's base to martyr yourself by like, you know, going to an island in the middle of like, you know, Indonesia that has never seen like a white person, and like they like row their boat up to shore and immediately get like pierced by like 12 arrows. You know, like that's the equivalent, and they die with a smile on their face. Like that's what they want to have happen. You know, they don't have self-preservation skills because literally their only goal is to perish in like a global war. But I don't think this will escalate into World War III, just to be clear. But like that doesn't mean they don't think of this as a global war.
there was a post today on social media from one of their politicians basically saying, and I'll quote him, "We're not worried about this battle, nor do we care about it. The missiles and planes that we were bombed with during the past 9 years are the same ones that America has today."
Yeah, I mean, it's the same religious zealotry that means that U.S. politicians on the right blindly adhere to Zionist policies. And they do so because their base wants to collect all of the world's Jews in Israel to fulfill a 2,000-year-old prophecy that will bring about the end of the world. Like, that's literally what's happening. That's what they want to happen. That's what they think is going to happen. Obviously, religious prophecy is bogus. That's not going to happen, but that nonetheless shapes a lot of our modern politics.
America was conducting this war against us undercover, and today we will confront it directly. It's a positive thing because America is what brought destruction, siege, and poverty to our country.
So instead of doing anything to contain the Houthis' aggression, the U.S. response, as perhaps many feared, risks, if not already is, expanding the threat of the Houthis. And any future attacks from the U.S., which the U.S. claims it will undertake, is going to do the same. It's going to make things worse.
Right. There does seem to be a real risk of further escalation at this moment. It's not clear how this is going to quiet down.
Well, what are the options for the U.S. if armed conflict and retaliation is proving to be so ineffective? What is basically the way out of a dynamic in which responses from the U.S. and its allies?
I'm not a Christian, but I understand wanting to die in battle for a cause you believe in. Unironically, go to therapy.
Are feeding the Houthi narrative and making the Houthis more popular at home and less likely to ever want to stop doing this.
The U.S. definitely doesn't have a great option or menu of responses in terms of how it's going to address the Houthi threat. However, one argument that we're hearing pretty consistently from regional American allies like Qatar and Oman, which is a neighbor of Yemen and knows Yemen very well, has been that the only way to address the threat posed by the Houthis is to resolve the underlying conflict that is inflaming tensions across the region. And that, they say, is the war in Gaza. And their argument essentially is that it is the war in Gaza.
And this is the thing, like, the United States, under pressure of the Houthis, is not going to try and end the war in Gaza, or end the genocide in Gaza. Under domestic pressure, they might, which is why we should be trying to organize more disruptive actions, like yelling at Joe Biden literally anytime he pops his head outside to sign a ceasefire, like push for the end of the genocide.
That is spreading all of these tensions.
That actually inconveniences people in power more so than any number of pirate attacks in the Red Sea.
Is causing all of these different forms of escalation, and that is giving the Houthis a pretext for their attacks. And if you can resolve that underlying conflict, if you can reach a ceasefire and you can diffuse that, then you will ultimately diffuse all of the other problems that are going on in the region right now.
My guess is that the U.S. rejects that logic because it might feel to them.
The main reason we're going over this, Firestar Awesome, is because this is literally the only place that I have not... This video, not even the New York Times, generally, but this particular interview is the only place I have seen a real discussion about what the actual motivations of the Houthi movement are versus their stated intentions. Because every mainstream outlet that I could find was talking about their stated intentions as if, like, that's actually the motivation behind what they're doing on a geopolitical stage. And that's never the case. Like, 99.9% of the time, stated intent is propaganda. What their actual aims are is something else entirely. And that applies to the United States. It applies to, like, any nation state, basically.
Them like a reward for what the Houthis are up to. You know, we're going to call for a ceasefire. We're going to push for an end to Israel's battle against Hamas just to stop the Houthis from attacking ships in the Red Sea.
Right. I mean, there's certainly a fear now in the region and beyond that the Houthis know that they have this power and that they're not going to simply stop using it, right? They know now that they can essentially, hold global trade hostage by attacking ships in the Red Sea. And it's difficult to imagine them never using that card again if they know that they can play it.
Right. And how should we think about that, Vivian? I mean, the reality that in a very short time, the Houthis go from the clan that they were to essentially the governing power in Yemen to now a force that is not just willing, but able to menace all of Western commerce in the Red Sea.
I mean, it's really a remarkable rise. I mean, the Houthis were such an underdog, and I don't think any of us imagined that we would be in this position when somebody sitting in New York even knows who they are, right? They have just risen so quickly, and they've defeated so many enemies that were so much more powerful than them, that they essentially see themselves as finally, in the divine right path now. They see God is on their side. They have no fear, partly because of that. I mean, the Houthis have been very upfront that they are absolutely not afraid of getting dragged into a long and extended war with the United States. And they've explicitly brought up, the precedents of Afghanistan and Vietnam and threatened that, come and enter Yemen, invade Yemen. We're ready for you. And you have no idea what is in for you, essentially. They're this guerrilla fighting force that has managed to withstand much more powerful entities for years and years. And that has put them in this position where they really feel that they have nothing to lose.
Well, Vivian, thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I just found this discussion very interesting in the context of, what we're talking about. Because the Houthis have definite domestic aims. They have definite, international aims. They have, an internal crisis brewing because... similarly to the Taliban, when they came back into power and you had stories about Taliban soldiers having to become bureaucrats and basically complaining that they aren't continuing to fight and are instead having to do an office 9 to 5 instead, doing the actual work of rebuilding Afghanistan. And the Houthis are running into the same problem in the territory that they control. It's just that their solution isn't to actually, buckle down and, start the rebuilding process and, guarantee, their civilians, basic rights and, right to electricity, water, etc. Their solution is, let's expand the conflict. Let's continue the war. That way, we can continue growing more powerful. the pressure is lifted off of us for actually doing the work of governance, we might be able to further our domestic aims by taking control of the rest of Yemen if Iran intervenes. We might be able to, take portions of Saudi Arabia even. Like, that's like an ongoing thing, you know? And I think that they are also motivated to spread their movement. And they've found that one of the best ways to do that is to seize control of territory and then forcibly recruit and conscript people into their movement. You know, they have a very much convert or die mentality that has, to their credit, had to be moderated in like the last couple years. But given that they're trying to expand this religious war to include all of Shia Muslims, that's probably not their ideal solution, we'll say.